December 7, 1941. 7:48 a.m. The moment Mitsuo Fuchida screamed, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" into his radio, he sealed the fate of 2,403 souls. But nobody knew that this same man would one day stand on American soil, preaching forgiveness to the very nation he tried to destroy. Nobody knew that the warrior who rained hell on Pearl Harbor would spend the rest of his life begging for redemption. Nobody knew that history's most famous surprise attack would birth one of its most shocking transformations. This is not just a war story. This is not just a redemption story, this is the story of a man who stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back and said, "Change, or be consumed." 1902. Nara Prefecture, Japan. Mitsuo Fuchida was born in a time when Japan was transforming from an isolated island nation into an imperial power. The Meiji Restoration had ended only decades before, and the country was drunk on modernization, on catching up to the Western powers that had once humiliated them. His father was a schoolteacher, strict and traditional, a man who believed in discipline over affection. His mother was gentle but distant, worn down by the endless work of maintaining a household with little money and less hope. Young Mitsuo grew up in their shadow, a quiet boy who spent hours staring at the sky, watching birds, dreaming of flight. While other children played soldiers in the streets, mimicking the veterans who'd fought in the Russo-Japanese War, Mitsuo sat on the hillside overlooking their village, watching clouds drift across the horizon, imagining what the world looked like from above. "You're wasting time," his father would scold him. "Dreams don't feed a family. Dreams don't bring honor." But Mitsuo couldn't help it. The sky called to him with a voice he couldn't ignore, a longing he couldn't explain. It was as if his soul belonged up there, not down here in the mud and rice paddies and endless expectations of a life mapped out before birth. At age 12, everything changed. The military was conducting a demonstration in a nearby town, showing off Japan's new air force, still in its infancy, still experimental. Mitsuo begged his father for weeks to let him attend. Finally, more to shut the boy up than out of any real interest, his father agreed. The airplane was a primitive biplane, barely more than canvas stretched over a wooden frame, held together with wire and prayer. It coughed and sputtered as it taxied down the dirt runway, looking like it might fall apart at any moment. The crowd gasped and pointed, equal parts amazed and terrified, but when it lifted into the air, Mitsuo stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, struck by something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the marvel of human flight. It was something deeper, more primal. As that fragile machine climbed into the sky, defying gravity and logic and every limitation that bound humans to the earth, Mitsuo felt his entire world shift. "That's where I belong," he thought, his heart pounding so hard he thought his chest might burst. Up there. Free. The pilot performed simple maneuvers, banking left, banking right, climbing, descending. To the crowd, it was entertainment. To Mitsuo, it was revelation. A divine calling. A purpose so clear and undeniable that everything else in his life suddenly seemed like preparation for this single moment of understanding. When the plane landed and the pilot climbed out, grinning and waving to the applause, Mitsuo pushed through the crowd, desperate to get close, to touch the machine, to somehow absorb whatever magic had just occurred. "Careful, boy," a soldier warned, grabbing his shoulder. "This is military equipment." But the pilot, a young lieutenant with kind eyes, smiled and waved the soldier off. "Let him look," the pilot said. "How else will we inspire the next generation?" Mitsuo ran his hand along the canvas wing, feeling the fabric still warm from the sun, smelling the oil and gasoline and something else, something that smelled like possibility. "Do you want to fly?" the pilot asked. Mitsuo nodded, unable to speak, afraid that if he opened his mouth he'd start crying again. "Then study. Work hard. The military needs pilots. Good ones. Brave ones. If you're willing to give everything for the emperor and the empire, they'll teach you to touch the sky." That night, Mitsuo lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the sight of that airplane climbing into the blue. And for the first time in his young life, he had a goal. A dream that felt more real than reality itself. He would become a pilot. No matter what it cost. 1917 to 1928. Naval Academy to flight school. When Mitsuo told his father he wanted to become a pilot, the old man didn't laugh this time. He got angry. The military is for soldiers, not dreamers, his father repeated, his voice cold. You'll be a teacher, like me. You'll have a stable life. A safe life. I don't want safe, 15-year-old Mitsuo said, the first time he'd ever directly contradicted his father. I want to fly. His father slapped him. Hard enough to split his lip. You want to throw your life away on some childish fantasy. You want to shame this family by failing. I won't fail. His father stared at him, something shifting in his eyes. Maybe respect. Maybe resignation. Maybe just exhaustion. If you do this, you do it alone. I won't help you. I won't support you. And when you fail, because you will fail, don't come crying back here. Mitsuo bowed, tasting blood in his mouth. I understand, father. He left the next morning, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning determination that felt more powerful than fear. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy entrance exam was designed to break candidates. Out of 300 applicants, only 30 would be accepted. The exam lasted 3 days, brutal mathematics, complex engineering problems, physical endurance tests that left grown men vomiting and weeping. Mitsuo was smaller than the other candidates. Weaker. He came from a poor family, had no connections, no advantages. While other boys had private tutors and military family backgrounds, Mitsuo had only his obsession. He studied 18 hours a day in the weeks leading up to the exam. His fingers bled from gripping pencils too hard, writing practice problems until his hand cramped. He ran every morning until his lungs burned, did push-ups until his arms gave out, forced his body to become something harder, something stronger, something worthy of the sky. On the day of the written exam, he sat in a hall with 299 other terrified teenagers, staring at questions that seemed designed to humiliate rather than assess. Trigonometry problems that required three-dimensional thinking. Physics questions about aerodynamics and lift and drag. Engineering puzzles about stress points and metal fatigue. Mitsuo closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the world fall away. There was only the test. Only the problems. Only the path to flight. 5 hours later, he set down his pencil, every question answered. He didn't know if they were correct. But he'd given everything he had. The physical exam was worse, running until candidates collapsed. Swimming in ice-cold water until hypothermia set in. Obstacle courses designed by sadists. Mitsuo watched bigger, stronger boys quit, crying, admitting defeat, but Mitsuo didn't quit, even when his lungs screamed for air. Even when his muscles stopped responding. Even when every logical part of his brain begged him to stop, to give up, to accept that he wasn't good enough. He kept going because quitting meant returning home in shame. Quitting meant never touching the sky. Quitting meant living the rest of his life wondering what if. And Mitsuo would rather die than wonder. 3 weeks later, the results were posted. 30 names on a board outside the academy headquarters. 300 boys crowding around, searching desperately for their names, hoping, praying. Mitsuo couldn't look at first. He stood back, watching other candidates celebrate or weep, feeling his entire future balanced on this single moment. Finally, he forced himself forward. Pushed through the crowd. Scanned the list. Fuchida, Mitsuo. Rank, 7. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Mitsuo walked away from the crowd, found a quiet spot behind the building, and cried for the first time since childhood. Not from sadness. Not from relief. But from the overwhelming weight of a dream becoming real. You made it, a voice said behind him. Mitsuo turned to see another new cadet, a tall, confident boy named Genda Minoru, who'd ranked 3rd. We both did, Mitsuo said, wiping his eyes, Embarrassed to be caught crying, Genda smiled. You know what they say about the academy, right? Getting in is the easy part. Surviving is the real test. He was right, the next 4 years were hell. Endless drills. Brutal physical training. Academic coursework that made the entrance exam look simple. And above it all, the constant reminder that they were training to die for the emperor, to sacrifice everything for the empire, to become weapons rather than humans. A pilot is not a person, their instructor, Commander Yamaguchi, would shout during morning formations. A pilot is an instrument of imperial will. You are the emperor's sword, his arrow, his lightning bolt. Your life belongs to Japan. Your death will bring honor to your family. This is your purpose. This is your only purpose. Most cadets accepted this. Embraced it. Found comfort in the certainty of their role, but Mitsuo struggled with it. He wanted to fly, yes. He wanted to serve his country, yes. But did that mean he had to stop being human? Did that mean he had to erase every part of himself that wasn't useful to the military? He never spoke these doubts aloud. To question was to be weak. And weakness meant expulsion. So he buried his doubts deep, focused on the training, and learned to become what they wanted him to be. WWII 1928. At age 26, Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida graduated from flight school near the top of his class. He'd earned his wings. He was finally a pilot, but the cost had been everything he used to be. The quiet boy who loved watching birds had been replaced by a precise, efficient, emotionless military instrument. You've done well, Commander Yamaguchi told him at graduation. You're one of the finest bombardiers I've trained. Your calculations are flawless. Your precision is unmatched. You'll serve the emperor with great honor. Mitsuo bowed, accepted the compliment, felt nothing. That night, alone in his quarters, he wrote a letter to his father. The first communication in 11 years. Father, I graduated today. I am now a pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy. You were right about one thing, it cost everything. But you were wrong about another. I didn't fail. I don't expect you to be proud. I don't expect forgiveness for leaving. But I thought you should know, I touched the sky. And it was worth it. Your son, Mitsuo, he never sent the letter because deep down, he wondered if it really had been worth it. If trading his humanity for wings was a fair exchange. If the sky he dreamed of as a boy was the same sky he now flew through as a weapon. He didn't know, and that uncertainty would haunt him for the next 13 years, until a December morning when all his doubts would crystallize into terrible certainty. 1937. Nanjing, China. Mitsuo Fuchida's first combat mission was supposed to be simple. Japan had invaded China, and the Imperial Army was pushing south toward Nanjing. The Navy's job was to provide air support, bombing Chinese defensive positions, destroying supply lines, clearing the way for ground troops. This will be easy, his squadron commander briefed them. The Chinese have no real air force. No significant anti-aircraft capabilities. You'll drop your bombs, return home, and be drinking sake by dinner. It wasn't easy. Fuchida climbed into his Mitsubishi G3M bomber that morning feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. This was what he'd trained for. This was his purpose. He was finally going to be a warrior, not just a student playing at war. But as his plane lifted off from the carrier and formed up with the rest of the squadron, reality hit him in a way training never had. He was going to kill people today. Not targets. Not objectives. People, Chinese soldiers, yes. The enemy, yes. But still people. Men with families, with dreams, with lives that would end because Mitsuo dropped bombs on them. Bombardier, this is pilot, his commander's voice crackled over the radio. We're approaching the target. Prepare for bombing run. Fuchida looked through his bomb sight at the city below. Nanjing. Ancient capital of China. Millions of people. And somewhere down there, Chinese defensive positions that he was supposed to destroy. The problem was, from 10,000 feet, it all looked the same. Buildings. Streets. People moving like ants. How was he supposed to tell soldiers from civilians? Military installations from homes. Begin bombing run, the commander ordered. All bombardiers, release on my mark. Fuchida's hands hovered over the release mechanism. His calculations were perfect: wind speed, altitude, trajectory. If he released now, his bombs would hit exactly where they were aimed, but where were they aimed? Mark. Fuchida pulled the release. Felt the plane lurch upward as 800 kilograms of explosives dropped away. Watched through his scope as the bombs fell. Impact, explosions bloomed across the city like deadly flowers. Buildings collapsed. Fires erupted. Even from this altitude, Fuchida could see people running, scattering, trying to escape the sudden hell that had appeared from the sky. Good hits, the commander praised. Return to base. But Fuchida couldn't look away. He kept staring down as his plane banked for home, watching smoke rise from the city, wondering how many people he'd just killed. Wondering if they were soldiers or civilians. Wondering if it mattered. That night, back on the carrier, his fellow pilots celebrated. They'd completed their mission. They'd struck a blow against the Chinese. They were warriors now, not just trainees. But Fuchida sat alone on the deck, staring at the stars, feeling something inside him crack. First mission is always hard, a voice said. Fuchida turned to see Commander Yamaguchi, his old instructor, standing in the shadows. I killed people today, Fuchida said quietly. You killed enemies. How do I know they were enemies? From 10,000 feet, everyone looks the same. Yamaguchi was silent for a long moment. You don't know, he finally admitted. And you never will. That's the burden of being a bombardier, Fuchida. You deal death from a distance. You never see their faces. Never hear their screams. Never know if your target was a soldier or a schoolteacher who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So how do you live with it? You tell yourself a story. You convince yourself that every bomb hit a legitimate target. That every person you killed deserved it. That you're fighting for a righteous cause, and the enemy is evil, and your actions are justified. Yamaguchi paused. And if you tell yourself that story long enough, eventually you start to believe it. And once you believe it, the killing gets easier. Is that what you did? Yes. Does it work? Yamaguchi looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, carried too much. Ask me again in 20 years. Over the next 4 years, Fuchida flew hundreds of combat missions. China. Southeast Asia. He became one of Japan's most skilled bombardiers, precise, efficient, reliable. The other pilots called him the calculator because his bombs always hit their targets, but they didn't know what it cost him. Every night, Fuchida saw faces in his dreams. Not real faces, he'd never seen his victims up close. But imagined faces. The sailor trying to evacuate his ship. The soldier screaming as flames consumed him. The child running from buildings that collapsed under his bombs. He started drinking to sleep. Then drinking to function. Then drinking just to feel something other than the gnawing guilt that followed him everywhere. You need to stop, Genda told him one night, finding Fuchida drunk in his quarters. You're one of our best pilots. The military needs you sharp. The military needs me to be a killer, Fuchida slurred. I'm very good at killing, Genda. Very good. Thousands dead because of me. But I can't remember why we're even fighting anymore. Can you? We're fighting for the Emperor. For the Empire. For Japan's rightful place in Asia. That's the story we tell ourselves. It's the truth. Is it? Or is it just what they taught us so we'd stop asking questions? Genda grabbed him by the collar, shook him hard. Listen to me. You can't think like this. You can't question like this. If you do, you'll break. And if you break, you're useless. You're worse than useless, you're a liability. So you need to pull yourself together, bury these doubts, and do your job. What if I can't? Then you die. Either in combat because you hesitated, or by your own hand because you couldn't live with yourself. Those are your options. Choose. Fuchida chose to keep flying. Keep killing. Keep burying his doubts under layers of duty and discipline, and the story he told himself about righteousness and honor and serving the emperor. It worked for a while, but stories have a way of falling apart when confronted with reality. And Mitsuo Fuchida's story was about to collide with the biggest reality of his life, November 1941. Aircraft carrier Akagi, Pacific Ocean. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the map spread across the table. 6 aircraft carriers. 4 battleships. 2 heavy cruisers. Over 400 aircraft. The most powerful naval strike force Japan had ever assembled, their target, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Heart of the United States Pacific Fleet. This plan is madness, one of the senior officers muttered, thinking Nagumo couldn't hear him. If we fail, America will crush us. If we succeed, we'll wake a sleeping giant who'll never forgive us. Nagumo heard. But he didn't respond. Because the officer was right, and everyone in the room knew it, Japan was cornered. America had cut off their oil supply in response to Japan's invasion of China. Britain and the Netherlands controlled the rubber, tin, and other resources Japan desperately needed for its war machine. The empire had 2 choices: submit to Western demands and abandon all their conquests, losing face and power, or strike first and hope the Americans would sue for peace after a devastating blow. They'd chosen war, but it was a desperate gamble. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Their oil reserves would last maybe 18 months. Their hope, their only hope, was that a surprise attack so devastating, so shocking, would break American morale and force them to negotiate a settlement. It was a plan based on wishful thinking and denial. But it was the only plan they had. Gentlemen, Nagumo finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of history. We have been given our orders by the Emperor himself. We will attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. We will destroy the American Pacific Fleet. And we will give Japan the breathing room we need to secure the resources we require. He paused, looked around the room at the nervous faces. I know some of you have doubts. I have them too. But doubt is a luxury we cannot afford. We are warriors. We follow orders. We serve the Emperor. And we trust that our leaders know what they're doing. What if they don't? Someone whispered. Nagumo didn't answer. Because he didn't have an answer. We need someone to lead the air attack, he continued, changing the subject. Someone who won't hesitate. Someone who can coordinate hundreds of planes in real time while dodging anti-aircraft fire. Someone who will get the job done no matter what. All eyes turned to Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. At-39, Fuchida was older than most combat pilots. His hair was graying. His face was lined with exhaustion and something that looked like permanent sadness. But his hands were steady, his mind was sharp, and his record was flawless. He'd flown over 3,000 combat hours. He'd trained most of the younger pilots in the fleet. He'd studied American naval tactics obsessively for months, memorizing ship classes, defensive capabilities, likely responses. He was the obvious choice, and he knew it. Fuchida, Nagumo said quietly. I'm giving you command of the first wave. 183 aircraft. 49 bombers, 40 torpedo planes, 51 dive bombers, 43 fighters. Your job is to destroy the American Pacific Fleet before they know we're there. Complete surprise is essential. If they detect us before the attack begins, we'll lose our only advantage. Everything depends on the first 15 minutes. If we can devastate them in those first minutes, we win. If not." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Fuchida stood, bowed deeply. "I understand, Admiral. I won't fail." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. This wasn't like bombing Chinese positions. This wasn't like hit-and-run raids on convoys. This was attacking the military of the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. This was starting a war that Japan probably couldn't win. What if we're making a terrible mistake? But he'd learned long ago to silence that voice. Doubt was weakness. Hesitation was death. He was a warrior, a weapon, an instrument of imperial will. He would do his duty. No matter the cost. December 6, 1941. 11:47 p.m. Fuchida's quarters, Akagi. Mitsuo Fuchida lay in his narrow bunk, listening to the ocean slap against the carrier's hull, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. In 8 hours, he would lead the largest aerial attack in history. In 8 hours, he would change the world forever. But tonight, all he could think about was his wife, Haruko. Sweet, patient Haruko, who'd married him 15 years ago despite knowing what military life meant. Who'd raised their 2 children mostly alone while he was deployed for months at a time. Who'd begged him, just once, just that one time, not to join the military. "War will take you from me," she'd whispered on their wedding night, both of them young and scared and pretending to be braver than they were. "Please, Mitsuo. Choose a different path." He'd kissed her forehead, promised everything would be fine, promised he'd be careful, promised he'd always come home. Liar. Tomorrow, he would fly into enemy territory, outnumbered, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, with only surprise as his shield. The odds of survival were uncertain at best. And if he died, Haruko would be alone. Their children, Yoshiya, age 13, and Miyako, age 10, would grow up without a father. Was this worth it? Was glory worth orphaning his children? Fuchida sat up, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. He thought about the American sailors sleeping in Pearl Harbor right now. Comfortable in their bunks, dreaming of home, completely unaware that death was sailing toward them at 20 knots. Did they have wives? Of course they did. Did they have children? Probably. Did they have dreams of growing old, of watching their kids get married, of dying peacefully in their beds surrounded by family? Of course they did. And tomorrow, Mitsuo Fuchida was going to end all of that. Thousands of men. Thousands of families. Thousands of futures erased because he dropped bombs on them. It's war, he whispered to himself, trying to believe it. This is what soldiers do. This is duty. This is honor. This is bullshit. The word appeared in his mind unbidden, shocking him with its clarity. All the propaganda, all the training, all the talk of honor and glory and serving the emperor, it was all just a story they told themselves to make the killing easier to bear. The truth was simpler and darker. War was humans murdering each other over resources and power and pride. There was no glory in it. No honor. Just death and suffering and trauma that would ripple through generations. But what choice do I have? Refuse the mission. That was desertion. Punishable by death, and worse, eternal shame for his family. Question the orders. That was insubordination. Career ending at best, execution at worst. No. He had no choice. Or rather, he'd made his choice years ago when he traded his humanity for wings. This was simply the bill coming due. Fuchida stubbed out his cigarette, lay back down, closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come. Instead, images flooded his mind. The Chinese cities he'd bombed. The ships he'd sunk. The men he'd killed from 10,000 feet, never seeing their faces, never hearing their screams, but knowing, always knowing, that they'd been human beings with names and stories and people who loved them. How many have I killed already? He'd never counted. Never wanted to know. But now, in the darkness of his quarters, waiting for dawn and destiny, he tried to add them up, hundreds. Thousands, he didn't know. And that was worse than knowing. At 3 a.m., Fuchida gave up on sleep. He dressed, grabbed his flight jacket, walked up to the flight deck. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, black and cold under a moonless sky. Perfect conditions for a surprise attack. Perfect conditions for slaughter. Other pilots were already there, checking their planes, whispering prayers to gods who probably weren't listening, smoking cigarettes with the desperate intensity of men who knew they might not survive the day. Commander Fuchida, a young voice called out. Fuchida turned to see Petty Officer Masaharu, a kid barely 20 years old, fresh out of flight school. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his cigarette. "Commander, are you afraid?" The question hung in the cold air. The honest answer was yes. Terrified. Afraid of dying, afraid of killing, afraid of starting something that couldn't be stopped, afraid of being wrong about everything he'd ever believed. But a commander couldn't say that. A commander had to be strong, confident, fearless. Every time, Fuchida heard himself say, the truth escaping before he could stop it. "I'm terrified every single time I fly into combat." Masaharu's eyes widened. "But, you're Commander Fuchida. You're a legend. You've flown hundreds of missions, and I've been scared during every single one." Fuchida lit his own cigarette, hand surprisingly steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Legends are just men who survived long enough to be remembered. Don't believe the stories, Masaharu. Heroes are just people too afraid to run away. Then how do you do it? How do you fly into danger when you're terrified? Fuchida thought about that. How did he do it? What kept him climbing into the cockpit, mission after mission, knowing that each one might be his last? "Because I'm more afraid of letting my crew down than I am of dying," he finally answered. "Because if I don't lead, someone else will, and they might not bring as many men home. Because..." He trailed off. Because why? Because the emperor commanded it. Because Japan demanded it. Because he'd trained his whole life for this and couldn't imagine another purpose. All those reasons felt hollow now. "Because I don't know what else to be," he admitted quietly. "This is all I am. A pilot. A weapon. Without this, I'm nothing." Masaharu nodded slowly, not understanding but accepting. "Sir, if you're afraid, and you still fly, that makes you braver than all of us." "No, Masaharu. It just makes me a fool who's good at hiding his fear." Fuchida stubbed out his cigarette. "Listen to me. When we attack tomorrow, stay close to my wing. Do exactly what I do. Nothing more, nothing less. If you survive your first combat mission, you'll have a chance at surviving the war. If you survive the war, you'll have a chance at living a real life. Southwest, stay close, stay smart, and don't play hero." "Yes, sir." Fuchida watched the kid walk away, shoulders a little straighter, fear a little more manageable. And he wondered how many of these young pilots would still be alive in 24 hours. Half. A quarter. He returned to his quarters as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Managed to sleep for maybe an hour, dreams filled with falling, drowning, burning. When the wake-up call came at 5 a.m., Mitsuo Fuchida rose to meet his destiny, ready or not, afraid or not. December 7, 1941. 6:15 a.m. The Akagi's flight deck was controlled chaos. Ground crew swarmed over aircraft like ants, performing final checks, loading ammunition, fueling planes. Officers shouted coordinates and weather updates. Pilots huddled in small groups, going over the attack plan one final time, their faces masks of concentration hiding terror. Mitsuo Fuchida climbed into his Nakajima B-5N bomber, the cockpit cramped and cold, smelling of oil and metal and fear. Behind him, His navigator, Lieutenant Mitsuo, settled into his position, double-checking coordinates on a map illuminated by a tiny red lamp. His radio operator, Petty Officer Kiyoshi Nishida, tested the communication systems, making sure they could contact the entire strike force. "Commander," Mizuki said quietly, "weather report looks perfect. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. The gods are smiling on us today. Or setting us up for a fall," Fuchida muttered, too quiet for Mizuki to hear. He ran through his pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, his hands moving automatically through procedures he'd performed thousands of times. Engine temperature. Oil pressure. Control surfaces. Bomb release mechanisms. Everything perfect. Everything ready. All aircraft, prepare for launch, the flight controller announced over the radio. First wave will begin takeoff in 5 minutes. Fuchida looked out his cockpit window at the other planes lined up on deck. 183 aircraft. The largest aerial strike force ever assembled. And he was responsible for coordinating all of them, for making sure they hit their targets, for turning planning into reality. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. What if I fail? What if I lead these men to their deaths for nothing? What if we're making a mistake that will haunt Japan for generations? He shook his head, banishing the thoughts. Too late for doubts. Too late for second-guessing. The die was cast. All that remained was execution. "Green light," the deck controller called out. "Commander Fuchida, you're cleared for launch." Fuchida gave the thumbs-up signal. Ground crew removed the wheel chocks. A launch officer waved the green flag with exaggerated motions, dramatic and almost absurd in the pre-dawn darkness. Go. Fuchida pushed the throttle forward. The Nakajima's engine roared to life, the bomber vibrating so hard he could feel his teeth rattling. The plane accelerated down the deck, wheels pounding the metal surface, faster, faster, the edge of the carrier rushing toward him, the ocean dark and hungry beyond the moment of truth. The point of no return. He pulled back on the stick, the plane lifted into the dark sky, leaving the safety of the carrier behind, committing to the attack, to history, to whatever consequences would follow. Behind him, 182 more aircraft followed, taking off in rapid succession, engines screaming, forming up in the darkness. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, all of them trusting Fuchida to guide them to the target, to bring them home alive. "All aircraft, this is Fuchida. Form up on my wing. We have 120 miles to Oahu. Maintain radio silence until I give the attack signal. Stay sharp. Stay focused. Remember your training." The formation took shape around him, a massive V stretching across miles of sky, a mechanical flock of predators heading toward prey that didn't know it was being hunted. The flight was smooth. Too smooth. Fuchida kept waiting for something to go wrong. For American patrol planes to spot them. For radar stations to detect their approach. For the trap to spring, for sirens to wail, for fighter planes to swarm up from Pearl Harbor and turn hunters into hunted, but nothing happened. The sky remained empty. The radio stayed silent. At 7:40 a.m., exactly on schedule, the first glimpse of Oahu appeared through scattered clouds. Green mountains rising from the ocean. Coastal towns still dark, people sleeping, completely unaware. And there, on the southern coast, glittering in the morning sun, Pearl Harbor. Fuchida raised his binoculars with trembling hands, scanned the harbor, felt his heart stop. 8 battleships lined up along battleship row like toys in a bathtub. Dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Hundreds of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. Everything exactly where intelligence said it would be. And not a single fighter plane in the air. Not a single gun firing. Not a single sign that the Americans had any idea what was about to happen. This was it. Complete surprise. The nightmare scenario for the Americans. The dream scenario for Japan. Fuchida's heart pounded so hard he thought his ribs might crack. His breathing came in short gasps. His hands shook on the controls. This is real. This is actually happening. In the next 2 minutes, I'm going to start a war that will kill millions. He grabbed the radio transmitter, took a deep breath, and screamed, 2. 2. 2. The attack signal. Short for Tatsugiki, charge. Then, to confirm complete surprise, he sent the second message, the one that would echo through history, the 3 words that would define his life: Tora. 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 Tiger. 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 230 miles away, on the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received the message. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer to gods he wasn't sure existed, and committed Japan to war. There's no turning back now. 7:48 a.m. The first wave hit Pearl Harbor like the wrath of an angry god. Torpedo bombers swept in at wave-top level, so low their propellers nearly touched the water. Pilots hunched over controls, navigators calling out adjustments, torpedo operators with fingers hovering over release buttons. They'd trained for this moment for months, modified torpedoes that could work in the shallow harbor, attack angles calculated to perfection, timing choreographed like a deadly ballet. The first torpedo hit the USS Oklahoma at 7:50 a.m. Boom. The explosion was visible from Fuchida's altitude, a geyser of water and steel erupting from the battleship's port side. Then another torpedo hit. And another. And another. The Oklahoma shuddered, listing violently to port. On deck, sailors poured out from below, confused, terrified, some still in their underwear, not understanding what was happening. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought the boilers had exploded. A few thought it was an earthquake. None of them realized they were being killed until the second wave of planes screamed overhead, machine guns blazing, red circles on wings marking them as Japanese, making the impossible suddenly, horrifically real. America is under attack. Fuchida circled at 10,000 feet, watching his carefully orchestrated plan unfold like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. He'd spent months on this choreography: which planes would attack first, which targets had priority, how to avoid friendly fire, how to maximize damage while minimizing losses. It was working perfectly, too perfectly. He watched the Oklahoma capsize, rolling over like a dying whale, trapping 429 men inside. Watched the California take multiple torpedoes, settle into the harbor mud, sailors jumping overboard into oil-slicked water. Watched the West Virginia erupt in flames, her ammunition magazines cooking off, small explosions rippling across her superstructure. Through his binoculars, Fuchida could see individual sailors. A man on the Oklahoma's deck waving his arms, trying to organize an evacuation, looking terrified and brave and completely doomed. Another sailor diving off the California, swimming desperately toward shore, his white uniform making him easy to track against the dark water. For a split second, these weren't targets. They were people, and then the Oklahoma finished capsizing, and the men on deck disappeared beneath the water, and Fuchida felt something inside him crack, felt the carefully constructed wall between warrior and murderer start to crumble. Commander Fuchida. His navigator shouted, breaking through his paralysis. The Arizona. High-level bombers are making their run on the Arizona. Fuchida forced himself to look away from the drowning sailor, to focus on the mission, to be the weapon he'd trained to be instead of the human he'd almost forgotten he was. All high-level bombers, this is Fuchida. Focus on the Arizona. Aim for the forward magazines. Make every bomb count. The dive bombers shrieked down from 10,000 feet, their attack angles almost vertical, screaming through anti-aircraft fire that was finally starting to fill the sky. Most of the bombs missed, fell harmlessly into the harbor, sent up impressive geysers but did no damage. But one bomb, just one out of dozens, found its mark. 8:06 a.m. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch battleship shell, punched through the Arizona's forward deck like a needle through paper, penetrated deep into the ship's guts, detonated inside the forward ammunition magazine where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder was stored. What happened next defied human comprehension. The explosion was cataclysmic. So massive it registered on seismographs 3,700 miles away. So loud it was heard in Honolulu 10 miles distant. So powerful it lifted the 608-foot, 33,000-ton battleship completely out of the water. The fireball rose over 1,000 feet into the air, higher than the mountains ringing the harbor, a mushroom cloud of burning fuel and ammunition, and human bodies vaporized instantly. The shock wave shattered windows across Oahu. The blast wave hit Fuchida's plane even at 10,000 feet, making his bomber lurch violently, nearly throwing him against the cockpit canopy. For a moment, Fuchida was blind. The flash was so bright it overwhelmed his vision, left purple afterimages burned into his retinas. He heard his radio operator scream something, couldn't make out the words over the roar that followed, a sound like the earth itself splitting open. When his vision cleared, the Arizona was gone, not sinking, not burning, not listing. Gone. In less than 10 minutes, 1,177 men died. Half of them, 573 men, vaporized so completely that their bodies were never found, not even fragments. Just erased from existence in a flash of heat that reached thousands of degrees. The other half trapped in flooding compartments, burning alive in fuel fires that spread across the harbor's surface, turning the water itself into flame. Fuchida stared at the catastrophe below, his hands gripping the controls so tightly his knuckles turned white, his breath coming in short gasps, his mind trying and failing to process what he'd just witnessed. We just killed over 1,000 men in 9 minutes. I just killed over 1,000 men. I did this. Sir. His navigator shouted. Sir, are you there? Commander Fuchida, respond. I'm here, Fuchida managed, his voice sounding distant and strange in his own ears. Anti-aircraft fire is intensifying. The Americans are getting organized. Should we make another pass or return to the carriers? Fuchida looked down at Pearl Harbor, now completely hidden beneath a blanket of smoke so thick it blocked out the sun. Fires burned everywhere. Ships were sinking or already sunk. The harbor looked like a vision of hell, like something from a nightmare made real. We did this. I did this. But the attack wasn't over. There were still targets untouched. The repair yards. The fuel storage tanks. The submarine base. And somewhere out in the Pacific, the American aircraft carriers, the Lexington, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, were still afloat, still operational, still dangerous. All units, this is Fuchida, he forced himself to say, pushing down the horror, burying it beneath layers of duty and discipline. Regroup for second attack run. Dive bombers, target the repair facilities. Level bombers, take out the fuel storage. Fighters, continue strafing the airfields. We maintain air superiority until I give the withdrawal order. The attack continued for another hour. Wave after wave of planes diving, bombing, strafing. Explosions rippling across the harbor. More ships hit, more men killed, more destruction layered on top of destruction. By 9:30 a.m., when Fuchida finally gave the order to return to the carriers, Pearl Harbor was unrecognizable. The harbor was choked with smoke. Oil fires burned on the water's surface. Ships were capsized, sunk, or sinking. Bodies floated everywhere. The airfields were carpeted with burning aircraft. Buildings were collapsed or collapsing. Total devastation. Complete success. Absolute catastrophe. Fuchida led the survivors back toward the fleet, his bomber's engine laboring, holes in his wings from anti-aircraft shrapnel, his mind blank and numb and trying not to think about what he'd just done. 9:45 a.m. Returning to Akagi. As Fuchida led the strike force back toward the carriers, he began counting planes. It was a habit from hundreds of missions, always count your formation coming and going, always know who made it home and who didn't. 183 aircraft in the first wave. He counted 154 returning. 29 planes lost. At least 58 crew members dead, probably more if any planes went down with full crews. Fuchida started going through names in his head. Shimizu, his dive bomber, took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire over Ford Island. Nakamura hit the water during his torpedo run, broke apart on impact. That kid, Masaharu, the one who'd been scared on the flight deck last night, the one Fuchida had told to stay close, where was he? Fuchida scanned the formation, looking for Masaharu's tail number, hoping, praying, nothing. The kid was gone. It doesn't matter, Fuchida told himself, voice dead even inside his own head. He was a soldier. He knew the risks. He died serving the emperor. It doesn't matter. But it did matter because Masaharu had been a 20-year-old kid, scared out of his mind, looking for reassurance from a commander who told him to stay close, stay smart, don't play hero. And now he was dead, shot down by American anti-aircraft fire, or crashed into the ocean, or blown apart in midair. Dead because Fuchida had led him into combat, had given orders that resulted in his death, had promised nothing but had implied safety through competence. Liar. Murderer. The words echoed in Fuchida's mind as the Akagi came into view, as he prepared for landing, as he went through the familiar motions of carrier recovery. When his wheels touched down on the deck, the entire crew erupted in cheers. Ground crew swarmed his plane. Officers rushed forward with congratulations. Over the ship's speakers, radio announcers were broadcasting news of the attack's success, devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet, at least 5 battleships sunk or heavily damaged. Japan achieves total surprise, the emperor is pleased. Admiral Nagumo himself walked across the deck to meet Fuchida as he climbed out of his cockpit. The old man was smiling, actually smiling, something Fuchida had never seen before. You've done it, Commander, Nagumo said, shaking his hand firmly. You've given Japan the advantage we desperately needed. You've bought us time to secure the resources we need. History will remember this day forever. And you'll be remembered as the men who made it happen. Thank you, Admiral, Fuchida heard himself say, the words automatic, meaningless, around him. Pilots were celebrating. Drinking. Singing. Reenacting their attack runs with wild gestures. The relief of survival mixing with the adrenaline of combat, creating a kind of euphoria that Fuchida remembered from his early missions, but he felt none of it. He felt hollow. Empty. Like something essential had been carved out of him and replaced with nothing. That night, after the celebrations had finally died down, after he'd been interviewed by 3 different reporters, after he'd briefed the Admiral on every detail of the attack, Fuchida finally escaped to his quarters. He pulled out his diary, stared at the blank page for a long time, pen hovering over paper. Finally, he began to write. December 7, 1941. Today I led the attack on Pearl Harbor. We destroyed 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 188 aircraft. American casualties are estimated at over 2,400 killed, 1,200 wounded. Our losses, 29 aircraft, 64 men. By any military measure, it was a complete success. We achieved total surprise. We crippled the American Pacific Fleet. We've secured Japan's strategic position for the coming campaign. So why do I feel like we just made the worst mistake of our lives? He stared at that last sentence for a long time. Then he underlined it. Twice, because even as his comrades celebrated, even as the emperor sent congratulations, even as Japan declared the attack a great victory, Fuchida couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The Americans at Pearl Harbor had been sleeping. Off duty. Many of them not even combat personnel, mechanics, cooks, clerks. And Japan had slaughtered them without warning, without declaring war, without giving them any chance to prepare or respond. That's not war. That's murder. But he couldn't say that. Couldn't admit that doubt. Because doubt was weakness, and weakness was failure, and failure was death. So he closed his diary, turned off the light, lay in his bunk, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come for a long time, and when it finally did, he dreamed of drowning sailors and burning ships and a 20-year-old kid named Masaharu who trusted him to keep him safe. December 1941, May 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed invincible. The military swept through the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress of British power in Asia, surrendered in a week, Winston Churchill calling it the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, one by one, Western colonies collapsed under the weight of Japanese military might. Mitsuo Fuchida flew mission after mission during this period. Bombing raids on Darwin, Australia, turning the harbor into an inferno that killed hundreds and sent the entire population fleeing inland. Air support for the invasion of Java, destroying Dutch defensive positions, paving the way for ground troops. Reconnaissance flights over the Coral Sea, searching for American carrier groups. He became Japan's most famous pilot. Newspapers ran stories about him with headlines like "The Hero of Pearl Harbor" and "The Emperor's Eagle." Children drew pictures of him in school. His hometown erected a statue in his honor, Fuchida in his flight suit, pointing heroically toward the sky, bronze face frozen in determined courage. None of them knew that the real Fuchida spent most nights drunk, trying to silence the screams that echoed in his head. "You need to slow down," Genda told him one evening, finding Fuchida alone in the officer's mess, working on his third bottle of sake. "I'm celebrating our victories," Fuchida slurred, gesturing vaguely at the propaganda posters covering the walls. "We're winning, Genda. We're actually winning. Japan is unstoppable. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is becoming reality. We're liberating Asia from Western imperialism. You don't believe that?" "Of course I don't." Fuchida poured another drink with shaking hands. "We're not liberating anyone. We're just replacing British colonialism with Japanese colonialism. We're conquering, not freeing. But that's what we tell ourselves, isn't it? That's the story that makes the killing easier." Genda sat down across from him, spoke quietly so no one else could hear. "Listen to me carefully, old friend. You need to be more careful what you say. There are people watching. People listening. If you keep talking like this, if you keep questioning the Emperor's divine mission, you won't just lose your command. You'll lose your life. Maybe that would be a mercy. Don't talk like that. We need you. I need you. You're one of our best pilots." "I'm a murderer," Fuchida interrupted, his voice suddenly sober and deadly serious. "That's all I am, Genda. A highly skilled, very efficient murderer. I killed over 1,000 men at Pearl Harbor. I've killed thousands more in the campaign since. I follow orders, I drop my bombs, and I don't look too closely at what happens after. That's who I am. That's all I'll ever be." Genda grabbed his wrist, squeezed hard enough to hurt. "You're a soldier. A warrior. You're serving your country. That's not murder, that's duty. What's the difference? Intent. Purpose. Honor. Is there honor in killing sleeping men? Is there purpose in attacking without warning? Is there?" "Stop." Genda's voice was sharp, dangerous. "I'm your friend, Mitsuo, so I'm going to pretend I didn't hear any of this. But you need to pull yourself together. Bury these doubts. Do your job. Because if you break, if you crack, you're not just destroying yourself. You're destroying your family, your crew, everyone who depends on you." Fuchida stared at his friend, saw genuine concern mixed with genuine fear, and realized Genda was right. He couldn't afford doubt. Couldn't afford conscience. Not in the middle of a war. Not when so many people were counting on him. So he did what he'd always done when the guilt became overwhelming, he buried it. pushed it down deep, covered it with layers of duty and discipline, and the story he told himself about serving the emperor.it worked for a while, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. And those cracks were about to become chasms, because while Japan was celebrating victories, reality was starting to intrude on the fantasy. Fuchida started noticing things. Small things at first. Supplies taking longer to arrive. Replacement parts becoming scarce. Veteran pilots dying and being replaced by inexperienced kids fresh out of training, boys who could barely land on a carrier in calm seas, let alone in combat conditions, and most concerning of all, America wasn't surrendering. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese leadership had expected the Americans to negotiate peace within 6 months. To accept Japan's dominance in Asia. To focus on their own hemisphere and leave the Pacific to Japan. Instead, the Americans started building. Fuchida saw the intelligence reports. Saw the numbers that made his blood run cold. America was producing ships faster than Japan could sink them. Producing planes faster than Japan could shoot them down. Training pilots, mobilizing troops, gearing up their entire industrial capacity for total war. We didn't cripple them at Pearl Harbor, Fuchida told Genda one night, both of them studying reconnaissance photos of American shipyards on the West Coast. We just made them angry. Then we'll hit them harder, Genda insisted, but Fuchida could hear the doubt creeping into his friend's voice. The Battle of Midway is coming. One more decisive blow, one more crippling defeat, and they'll have to negotiate. Fuchida wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that one more victory would end this. That Japan could somehow win a war against a nation with 10 times their industrial capacity, unlimited resources, and a population that was now united in rage, but he didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it, because the numbers didn't lie. And the numbers said Japan was going to lose. June 3, 1942. Evening before the Battle of Midway. The plan for Midway was ambitious, complex, typical of Japanese naval strategy, multiple simultaneous operations designed to confuse and overwhelm the enemy. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north. A carrier strike on Midway Island to destroy its airbase. And then, when American carriers rushed to defend Midway, the Japanese fleet would ambush them, sink them, and secure naval dominance in the Pacific. It was the kind of plan that worked beautifully in war games. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it depended on the Americans doing exactly what Japan expected. On surprise. On the Americans not knowing what was coming, but the Americans had cracked Japanese naval codes. They knew about Midway. They were waiting. Fuchida didn't know this. None of them did. That evening, as Fuchida prepared his flight plan in his quarters aboard the Akagi, he felt something he'd never felt before: a major operation. Doubt that extended beyond moral concerns into practical ones. Something feels wrong. He couldn't explain it. Couldn't point to specific intelligence or evidence. It was just a feeling, an instinct honed by hundreds of combat missions, a voice in his gut that said, "This is a trap." But how could it be? American intelligence was famously poor. American forces were scattered, disorganized, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and the losses that followed. Japan held every advantage: more carriers, more experienced pilots, better aircraft. So why does this feel like we're walking into an ambush? At 11 p.m., as Fuchida was double-checking his calculations, a sharp pain stabbed through his abdomen. He gasped, doubled over, clutching his stomach. Not now. Not now. Not the night before the biggest battle of my life. The pain passed. He straightened up, took a few deep breaths, told himself it was just stress, just nerves, just the usual pre-battle anxiety manifesting physically. By midnight, the pain was back, worse this time. Sharp, constant, radiating from his lower right abdomen. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his preparations, but the pain kept intensifying, kept demanding attention. At 1 a.m., he started vomiting. By 2 a.m., he had a fever. By 3 a.m., the pain was so severe he couldn't stand upright. "You need the doctor," his roommate insisted, seeing Fuchida curled in his bunk, face pale and sweating. "No. I'm fine." Just need to rest. The attack is at dawn. You're not fine. You look like you're dying. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, took one look at Fuchida, and his face went pale. Appendicitis. Advanced. We need to operate immediately. No, Fuchida gasped through the pain. I have to lead the attack. The Admiral is counting on me. The entire fleet, if we don't operate right now, you'll be dead by morning. The appendix has probably already ruptured. You're going septic. This isn't optional, Commander. They carried him to the ship's medical bay, a tiny room barely large enough for an examination table, certainly not designed for surgery. The doctor laid out his instruments, looked at Fuchida with something like pity. We don't have proper anesthesia. Just sake to dull the pain. This is going to be difficult. Just do it. Fuchida ground out through clenched teeth. They poured sake down his throat until everything became fuzzy and distant. Then the doctor cut into his abdomen with a scalpel that had been sterilized with more sake, and Fuchida screamed as hands reached inside him, as the infected appendix was removed, as he was stitched back together with thread meant for mending uniforms. The surgery took 40 minutes. It felt like 40 hours when it was over. Fuchida lay on the table, bandaged and exhausted and alive, listening to the sounds of aircraft launching above his head. The attack was beginning, without him. June 4, 1942. 7:30 a.m. Fuchida woke to the sound of alarms. Not practice alarms. Not drill alarms, real alarms. Air attack. Enemy dive bombers. All hands to battle stations. He tried to sit up, felt his surgical wound tear, felt blood soaking through his bandages. The doctor rushed in, tried to push him back down. Commander, you can't move. You'll kill yourself. What's happening? Fuchida demanded. What's the situation? Before the doctor could answer, the ship lurched violently. A massive explosion shook the Akagi from bow to stern. Then another. And another. Boom. 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 Through the walls, Fuchida could hear screaming. Running. Shouting in panic, not in order. The organized chaos of a well-trained crew had dissolved into simple chaos. We're hit, the doctor said unnecessarily, his hands shaking as he tried to rebandage Fuchida's wound. American dive bombers. They caught us with all our planes on deck, fully fueled, fully armed. Another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red. We have to abandon ship, the doctor said. Can you walk? I can try. Fuchida slid off the examination table, nearly collapsed as pain shot through his abdomen, forced himself upright through sheer willpower. The doctor supported him, and together they staggered toward the door. Outside was hell. The flight deck was an inferno. Planes were burning. Ammunition was cooking off in small explosions that sent shrapnel scything across the deck. Ground crew were on fire, running, screaming, diving overboard. Pilots trapped in cockpits pounded on canopies that had warped shut in the heat, their screams audible even over the roar of flames. The stairs, the doctor shouted over the noise. We need to get to the starboard side. An explosion cut off his words. The deck buckled beneath them. Fuchida felt himself falling, hit metal hard, felt his surgical wound rip open completely. When he looked up, the doctor was gone. Just gone. Vaporized by the blast, or blown overboard, or simply erased from existence in the chaos. Fuchida lay there, blood pooling beneath him, watching his ship die around him. The Akagi, pride of the Japanese fleet, the carrier he'd called home for years, the ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was burning from bow to stern, listing heavily, clearly doomed. Through the smoke, Fuchida could see other carriers burning. The Kaga. The Soryu. All three of Japan's premier carriers, destroyed in minutes by American dive bombers that had appeared out of nowhere, that had caught them at the worst possible moment, that had turned the tide of the battle before it had even really begun. We walked into an ambush. They knew we were coming. They were waiting, and now we're dying. Two junior officers appeared through the smoke, grabbed Fuchida under the arms, dragged him toward the side of the ship. "Commander, we have to go. The fire's reaching the main magazine." "When it goes," they didn't finish the sentence. Just lifted him over the railing and dropped him into a lifeboat that was already overcrowded with wounded and burned sailors. As the lifeboat pulled away from the Akagi, Fuchida watched his ship sink. Watched hundreds of men go down with her, trapped below decks, or too injured to escape, or refusing to abandon their posts, going down with honor rather than facing the shame of survival. Admiral Nagumo was pulled from the water a few boats away, his face black with smoke, his eyes distant and shocked. The commander of the most powerful carrier strike force in history, reduced to a dripping, traumatized survivor floating in a lifeboat. "How many carriers lost?" Nagumo asked, his voice barely a whisper. "3 confirmed, sir. Possibly 4. The Hiryu is still operating, but she's damaged and under heavy attack. 4 carriers. Out of 6. 2/3 of Japan's carrier strength, destroyed in one morning." Fuchida floated in the lifeboat, surrounded by the dying and the dead, staring at the burning wrecks that dotted the ocean, and felt something fundamental break inside him. Japan is going to lose this war. The thought was so clear, so certain, so undeniable that it cut through the pain and shock and trauma. Pearl Harbor hadn't crippled America. It had awakened them. And now the Americans were coming with a vengeance, with better intelligence, with better tactics, with an industrial capacity that Japan could never match. "We're doomed. We were always doomed, and I helped make it happen." June 1942, August 1945. 3 years of dying slowly. After Midway, something changed in Mitsuo Fuchida. The confident pilot, the skilled bombardier, the warrior who'd led the attack on Pearl Harbor, that man died in a lifeboat watching the Akagi sink. What survived was something else. Something hollow. He recovered from his surgery, slowly, painfully. The wound got infected despite the doctor's best efforts. For weeks, Fuchida lay in a hospital bed, delirious with fever, hallucinating, seeing the faces of everyone he'd killed rising from the floor to stare at him with accusing eyes. When he finally recovered enough to return to duty, he discovered he'd become something of a legend, the pilot who survived Midway despite being injured, the warrior who'd been blessed by the gods, the men who couldn't die. "You're lucky, Fuchida," other pilots would tell him. "The gods are protecting you. They have plans for you." But Fuchida didn't feel lucky. He felt cursed, because everyone around him kept dying. June 1944. Battle of the Philippine Sea. Fuchida was assigned as air coordinator for what was supposed to be Japan's comeback, a massive carrier operation to destroy American forces in the Philippine Sea. 400 aircraft. The largest carrier operation since Midway. It was slaughter. American radar detected the incoming planes hours before they arrived. American fighters, new models, faster and better armed than anything Japan had, tore through the Japanese formations like wolves through sheep. In what Americans mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost 600 aircraft and 3 carriers in a single day. Fuchida survived. Of course he survived. He'd been coordinating from a battleship, not flying, watching the disaster unfold through binoculars and radio reports. Watching as every squadron he'd trained, every pilot he'd mentored, was systematically destroyed. "All units, withdraw," he finally ordered, his voice dead. Anyone still airborne, return to carriers immediately. But many of them couldn't return. Their carriers were sunk. They circled until their fuel ran out, then ditched in the ocean, most of them drowning before rescue could arrive. Fuchida spent that night counting the lost. 400 aircraft. 600 pilots and crew. 3 carriers. Thousands of highly trained personnel who couldn't be replaced, and he'd survived again. October 1944. Kamikaze operations. By late 1944, Japan was desperate. Conventional tactics weren't working. The Americans just had too many ships, too many planes, too many everything. So Japan created the kamikaze program, suicide attacks where pilots would deliberately crash their bomb-laden planes into American ships. "We're asking for volunteers," the commander told Fuchida during a briefing. "Pilots willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the Emperor." Fuchida looked around the room at the young faces staring back at him. Boys, really? 17, 18, 19 years old. Fresh out of training. Barely able to land on a carrier, let alone navigate combat, they were throwing children into the fire because they'd run out of real warriors. "I volunteer," Fuchida heard himself say, every head turned toward him. The commander blinked in surprise. "Commander Fuchida, that's not necessary. You're too valuable as a trainer, as a coordinator. I should have died at Midway," Fuchida interrupted. "I should have died at the Philippine Sea. I should have died 100 times by now. If the gods are keeping me alive, then let me die with purpose. Let me die serving the Emperor." The commander studied him for a long moment. "No. Sir, you're too valuable to waste on a kamikaze mission. You can train 10 pilots for every one of you. Your death would cost Japan more than it would gain. Then what use am I?" Fuchida asked, not caring anymore that he was questioning orders in front of junior officers. "What purpose do I serve? Everyone around me dies while I survive. What am I being saved for?" The commander didn't answer. Because there was no answer, Fuchida watched as those teenagers, boys who should have been in school, not in cockpits, flew off to die. Watched them crash into American ships, explosions bright against the setting sun, wondering if they felt peace in their final moments or just terror. He survived that too. Of course he did. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. Fuchida was scheduled to visit Hiroshima on August 6, a planning meeting for upcoming defensive operations. His train was supposed to arrive at 8 a.m. The train was delayed. Signal failure. Track maintenance. Some mundane railway problem that added 2 hours to his journey. At 8:15 a.m., an American B-29 bomber dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. An atomic bomb, the city vaporized. 70,000 people killed instantly. Another 70,000 would die from radiation poisoning over the following months. Fuchida arrived on August 7 to find nothing but ash and ruins. The city he was supposed to be in, the meeting he was supposed to attend, the colleagues he was supposed to meet with, all gone. Erased. As if they'd never existed. He stood in the remains of Hiroshima, surrounded by the walking dead, people so badly burned they looked like ghosts, people bleeding from every orifice from radiation sickness, people wandering in shock looking for family members who'd been vaporized. Why am I still alive? That question had haunted him since Midway. But now it consumed him completely. Why do I survive when everyone else dies? What cosmic joke is this? What purpose could there possibly be for keeping me alive through all of this? He had no answer. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the radio, his voice thin and breaking, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their god emperor speak, and he sounded painfully, undeniably human. The war was over, Japan had lost, and Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, the men who'd started it all, had survived everything, survived while millions died, survived while his country burned, survived while his purpose, his identity, his entire worldview collapsed into ash. Why am I still alive? He didn't know, but he was about to find out. September 1945. Uraga, Japan. Mitsuo Fuchida returned to his hometown a ghost. Not literally dead, but not really alive either. Something in between. Something broken. His wife, Haruko, barely recognized him when he appeared at their door. He'd lost 40 pounds. His hair had gone completely gray, though he was only 43. His eyes were hollow, distant, like he was looking at something far away that only he could see. "Mitsuo," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're home. You're actually home." She wrapped her arms around him, held him tight, and Fuchida stood there like a statue, unable to return the embrace, unable to feel anything except a vast, empty numbness. The children want to see you, Haruko said, pulling back, wiping her tears. Yoshiya and Miyako, they've been waiting. Not yet, Fuchida said quietly. I need time. Because how could he face his children? How could he look into their innocent eyes and pretend to be the hero they thought he was? How could he lie to them about what he'd done, what he'd become? Japan was in ruins. Cities destroyed by American bombing. The economy collapsed. Millions dead. The emperor had been forced to renounce his divinity, admitting on radio that he was just a man, just a human being who'd made terrible mistakes. Everything Fuchida had fought for, the empire, the glory, the dream of Japanese dominance, had turned to ash. Literally. The country was covered in ash from burned cities, ash from cremated bodies, ash from incinerated dreams. What was it all for? That question haunted him day and night. He'd killed thousands of people. He dedicated his life to serving an empire that had proven to be built on lies. He'd sacrificed his humanity, his conscience, his soul for a cause that was not only defeated but had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. What was it all for? Fuchida tried to adjust to civilian life, but nothing worked. He got a job at a factory assembling bicycles, humiliating work for a famous pilot, but all that was available in the devastated economy. He attended veterans' meetings where men sat in silence, drinking, unable to talk about what they'd done, what they'd seen. He smiled when neighbors recognized him, called him a hero, asked him to tell stories about Pearl Harbor. He lied and said it had been glorious, honorable, everything propaganda had claimed, and every night, he woke up screaming. The nightmares were always the same. He was back in his bomber, flying over Pearl Harbor, watching the Arizona explode. But this time, he could see the faces of the men dying. This time, he could hear their screams. This time, as he circled the harbor, the burning ships became Japanese cities, and the dying sailors became his own people, and he realized he'd been bombing his own country all along. You need help, Haruko begged him. After the 5th night in a row she found him screaming, drenched in sweat, clawing at his own arms hard enough to draw blood. Please, Mitsuo. Talk to someone. See a doctor. Do something. There's no help for what's wrong with me, he told her. There's no medicine for guilt. No cure for being a monster. You're not a monster. You were a soldier. You followed orders. I murdered over 2,000 people at Pearl Harbor. I killed thousands more in the campaigns that followed. Following orders doesn't change that. It doesn't make it better. It just makes me a monster who was good at following orders. Haruko didn't know what to say to that. Because what could she say? He was right. Factually, objectively right. He'd killed thousands of people. That was simply true. Whether that made him a monster or a warrior or something in between, that was the question he couldn't answer. October 1947. Afternoon, a former soldier visited Fuchida, a man named Takahashi who'd served on one of the carriers at Midway, who'd survived the sinking of the Soryu, who'd spent the rest of the war in various duty stations, watching Japan slowly lose everything. You look terrible, Takahashi said bluntly, sitting across from Fuchida in the tiny apartment he shared with his family. I feel terrible. Join the club. Half the men I know have killed themselves. The other half are slowly drinking themselves to death. Fuchida nodded. He'd considered both options. Suicide would be honorable, taking responsibility for his failures, accepting the consequences of his actions. Drinking himself to death would be slower but required less courage. But I found something, Takahashi continued, pulling out a pamphlet from his jacket. Something that I don't know. It helped. A little. Fuchida took the pamphlet reluctantly. It was cheaply printed, probably on an American press. The title was in Japanese, The Power of Forgiveness, the story of Margaret Covell. Who is Margaret Covell? Fuchida asked, not really caring but making conversation because Takahashi had come all this way to visit him. An American woman. Her parents were missionaries in the Philippines. When the war started, Japanese soldiers captured them. Takahashi paused, his face darkening. You know what we did to prisoners. Especially Westerners. Especially missionaries. Fuchida knew. He'd heard the stories. The atrocities committed by Japanese troops in the Philippines, China, Burma. Torture. Rape. Execution. Cruelty beyond imagination, justified by propaganda that said Westerners weren't really human, that they deserved whatever happened to them. They tortured her parents, Takahashi continued quietly. 4 days. Then they killed them. Slowly. So this woman must hate us, Fuchida said. Must want revenge. I don't blame her. That's what I thought too. But after the war, she came to Japan. Not for revenge. To help. Fuchida looked up sharply. What? She's been treating wounded Japanese soldiers. Caring for orphans. Teaching in schools. She's been here for 2 years, living in Tokyo, helping the people whose countrymen murdered her parents. That's impossible. I thought so too. So I went to see her. I asked her how she could forgive us. How she could help the people who killed her parents. What did she say? She said her Christian faith taught her that Jesus Christ forgave his enemies. Even the ones who killed him. Even the Roman soldiers who nailed him to the cross. And if Jesus could forgive, then she could forgive. She had to forgive. Because holding on to hatred would destroy her just as surely as it destroyed her parents. Fuchida stared at the pamphlet in his hands, at the photo of a smiling Western woman surrounded by Japanese children, and felt something crack inside his chest. How? He whispered. How is that even possible? How do you forgive someone for murdering your parents? I don't know, Takahashi admitted. But she did. And if she can forgive that level of evil, maybe there's hope for us too. Maybe forgiveness is possible. Maybe we're not beyond saving. After Takahashi left, Fuchida sat alone in his apartment, staring at the pamphlet, trying to understand forgiveness, such a strange concept. In Japanese culture, in the military world he'd inhabited for decades, forgiveness was weakness. You took responsibility for your failures. You accepted punishment. You carried your shame with honor. But forgiveness, letting go of guilt, that wasn't even discussed. But this woman, this Margaret Covell, had somehow found a way to transform her hatred into love. Her desire for revenge into a desire to heal. If she can do it, maybe I can too. Maybe there's a way out of this darkness. Maybe I don't have to spend the rest of my life drowning in guilt. It was the first spark of hope Fuchida had felt since Midway. Small. Fragile. But real. He didn't know it yet, but that spark was about to become a fire that would transform him completely.